If you're like most timber owners, you've probably broken a few springs. FalconRC makes a great set of shocks that replace the stock timber springs, and so far, they seem indestructible. FalconRC is a small company that sells aftermarket upgrade kits for models like the Turbo Timber Evolution. So we reached out to see if they'd send over one of their gear upgrade kits to demo on the channel. These things are super sweet. Weight was one of our initial concerns, considering the timber is already pretty heavy as is, but it's only a 35-gram weight addition to basically eliminate the spring breakage issue that so many timber pilots seem to encounter. Pricing is respectable at $53 for the set. Installation is simple and takes about 10 minutes with a drill. The instructions go over everything, you really can't screw it up. It's important to remember that this is a gear upgrade, not a skill upgrade. Skill is a function of time spent failing, learning, and improving. Skill is not something that you can buy. A set of replacement springs is not going to make your landings perfect just by installing them, as you can see here. Practice makes perfect, or at least, that's the idea. I'll go over the stick movements and theory behind making good approaches and landings so that you don't bring home a perfect set of FalconRC gear attached to a busted pile of packing peanuts. Let's get started with one thing that I'll caution you to avoid doing unless you're really comfortable with it. Don't take off toward yourself. I find it much more difficult to control tail draggers while they're coming toward me, especially timbers, because the shape of the fuselage makes it easy for me to ground loop it. I much prefer taking off away from myself, which makes it much easier to track where the tail is in comparison to the nose, which usually keeps me from ground looping a wheel takeoff or landing. Taking off with the main wheels requires some finesse if you're flying off pavement. There's still some effort involved with grass, but grass tends to hold the plane tracking straighter than pavement. I prefer to push the elevator down a little as I advance throttle, but the downforce of the horizontal stabilizer will automatically begin to make the tail rise. Whatever your preferred technique, smooth and slow is the key here. If you throttle up too fast, it'll ground loop a lot easier on you, or it'll just look goofy. Once the tail begins flying, you should already be correcting for any yaw deviation by applying rudder to counter the P-factor. After a moment or two, you can pull the elevator gently to rotate the plane and begin flying. Taking off on the main wheels will present a challenge if you're not used to P-factor with tail draggers. Remember that it's okay to fail. You will ground loop eventually. Add some red electrical tape to the wing skids, it'll look good and act as armor too. Approaches are, believe it or not, the most important part of your landing. A good approach makes landing very easy. A poor approach makes landing hellish and more difficult than it has any right to be. The key to a good approach is lining up with the runway. Many pilots bank and yank, but forget that rudder is key to turning the nose to keep it pointing into the direction that you intend to go. Don't be afraid of using rudder. If you take nothing else from this lesson, take this. It's required to learn how to use it if you want to improve your landings and your takeoffs. There is no substitute. Rudder usage will take practice, but ultimately you will get the hang of it. Always remember that rudder use will cause the inboard wing to drop. If you use left rudder, the left wing will drop. Right rudder causes the right wing to drop. Using a little bit of counter aileron is normal and to be expected. Rudder is definitely one of the most important control surfaces at your disposal, so you should get used to it, become friends with it, and use it often. It's a vital tool to control your aircraft. Wheel landings are just like takeoffs, except in reverse. You point the nose with rudder, keep the wings as level as possible, and gently set it down as you reduce throttle so that it plants on the mains. The moment the wheels touch, counter any yaw you see with rudder and try to keep it tracking straight. Timbers can be definitely a little tricky to keep a perfect center line, so don't fret if it's a little squirrely. Your main focus is keeping the plane tracking as straight as possible as the tail stops flying and the tail wheel makes contact with the ground. You'll be dancing on the rudder stick a lot, but if done right, it should look great. Again, I need to stress that not every landing is going to be perfect. Even the examples that I'm using here could be improved. What's important is the technique and the fact that the timber is coming back safely. And with the FalconRC spring replacement, none of the springs are breaking either. Now that's something I think we can all get behind. 3-point landings are super easy. There's not a whole lot to it aside from pulling the elevator at the right airspeed. The tail is forced down, the nose is forced up, and the timber stalls onto all three wheels with minimal rollout. This is our preferred way to land on grass, but you won't get much of a 3-point landing if you don't follow our setup guide to max out the timber's throws. That's linked in a card in the top right and in the description too. It's worth noting that you don't need the AGFRC servos, but they don't hurt. Having a slightly nose-heavy CG helps a ton here too. We fly with our battery shoved as far back as possible and use a lightweight Spectrum 2200 4-cell pack as well. If you guessed that 3-point takeoffs are super easy, you are totally right. They really are very simple. Hold full stick, throttle up, and let it rip. Some flaps help too if you really want to shorten the takeoff roll. You might need a little rudder after takeoff if you held too much elevator, but otherwise it should lift up really fast. And pushing the nose down is all you need to do to keep it flying to avoid hovering. Timbers take off in a few feet, very much unlike the Citabria that Zach from Tail Heavy Productions took me up in last year. 3-point takeoffs work great for grass because they force the tail down even with bumpy terrain. Even the best designed spring systems can't stop grass from grabbing a plane and flipping it. Like I said before, gear upgrades are not a substitute for skill. Slipping involves flying in with some thrust and a lot of rudder input on the approach. You can counter the wing drop with aileron, and I like to use some elevator pressure to force the timber to stay level as it drops. Slipping makes it very easy to drop altitude without gaining a lot of airspeed. This is a great technique to practice for improving your short field flying, or just to fly in places you probably shouldn't. While there are better airplanes out there for flying in confined spaces, I tend to believe that it's the pilot, not the plane, determining success at the end of the day. This one is really tricky and will require a lot of practice. You'll probably scrape up your wings attempting it too, but that's what the red electrical tape on the wing guards is for. You'll need to be confident with your stick and rudder skills, because you'll have to add rudder as you're rolling the plane on the ground or bringing it in with a mild slip and dropping it in on a single wheel. Rudder use is absolutely critical here because you'll start ground looping quick if you don't keep the tail driving the main straight down the runway. This will take practice, but you'll amaze all of your buddies with your newfound skill. Just don't be afraid to fail or push your own limits. That's where your skill building will come from. Before we get into bashing up the Falcon gear, one thing we love about this upgrade set is that you can adjust the gear angle by rotating the pushrod sleeve. You can actually make it sit taller or lower depending on what kind of terrain you're dealing with. It's really quite nice and built solidly, exactly what I expect for the price point. It's just a shame that the gear can't extend the wheels about 3 feet up because the guy who's supposed to mow the airport isn't doing his job and the timber sucks as a lawnmower. I beat the hell out of the Falcon gear and they didn't break or show any signs of damage. All they had to show for the bashing was a bunch of grass stains that were wiped away easily with a damp paper towel. They aren't cheap to replace the timber springs, considering that the stock springs cost about 10% of what the Falcon gear set does, but you definitely do get what you pay for here. The stock springs worked well for us, but if you want to beat up your gear and not worry about spring failure, the FalconRC gear system comes highly recommended. They're a solid 9 out of 10 from us. The only thing that would make them a 10 out of 10 would be reducing the all-up weight to 10 grams, so there's much less wing loading penalty. If you fly the timber on the edge of its envelope, you'll notice the added weight, but most people won't, so this is something that we definitely recommend if you want break-free flying. What do you think about the FalconRC system? Drop us a note in the comments and come chat with us on Discord via the invite in the description. See you guys next time with a new upload.